Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at the Mahāsupina Jataka. This is Jataka number 77, and it's the great dreams of King Pasenadi of Kosala. It's one of the birth stories, and birth stories are one of the 9 ways that we can learn the Dhamma. So the Buddha has suttas, which are the discourses, which we usually go through, mixed prose, gaya. We also have Vyakarana, the explanations, gathas, which are the verses in poetic form, udana, the inspired utterances, of course the itivutaka, the quotes of the Buddha, then these birth stories, jatakas, and then abhuta dhammang, the amazing stories, and then lastly the vedalang, the questions and answers or subtle analysis. So we learn Dhamma through these different means, and the Buddha encourages that. And what he says is, when we understand the meaning through what we learn in this way, then after we've understood it, we practice it. So in this particular Jataka, it's a very powerful one, very interesting Jataka story, but it resonates on many levels because the meanings of the king's dreams that the Buddha explains, we learn so much from them. We learn so much because he's correcting our view or pointing out how our view can be corrected. And what is very obvious or apparent from when you listen to this Jataka story is that our world is very much in decline, in some aspects more than others. And you see the truth of the Buddha's teachings. So this Jataka story is not prophecy or fortune telling or prediction. It's really what the Buddha sees with his knowledges, with his insight. And it's pointing to morality, pointing to virtue, that when you don't have virtue and you keep harnessing unwholesome behavior or actions and they're unskillful or bad, then you reap the bad result, the unwholesome result. So individually or collectively, if we continue down this path, then we can expect more of the same. The world can expect more of the same, more decline. And it can be worse than what we're experiencing, which is what we hear in the explanations of these dreams. So the value of this Jataka is really being able to see clearly in this different way that the Buddha teaches us, and to ensure that we correctly understand kamma. What we experience right now is the result of past kamma. So if we wish to influence or change the course of the future, then we need to correct our behavior now. All of us, individually and collectively. So that means more wholesome behavior through body, speech, and mind. In this particular Jataka, the Buddha tells King Pasenadi of Kosala that he has nothing to fear. But for us, we're at a different time, and there is much for us to fear because what we're already experiencing is some of what the dreams are actually telling us. And for us, we may want to stem the tide of the decline of the world, whether it's what's happening in our environment, what's happening with our relationships and our behaviors towards each other, with the level of morality in the world. What we're seeking is really safety, individually and collectively. And it may be that we cannot change what is collectively happening in the world because that tide is so strong. The amount of burning that is happening in the world is too great. But individually, what you can take away from this teaching is to ensure that you know what is the right kind of conduct, what will lead you to safety, what is important from the Buddha's teaching, and to know that developing the Noble Eightfold Path is how you find the way out of suffering. If anything, this Jataka story gives more weight to walking the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. So let's begin. The Jataka story begins with King Pasenadi of Kosala awakening after having 16 terrifying dreams. And he's quite shaken, and so he goes to find out what they mean. So the first people that he goes to consult are his Brahmin advisors, and he explains to them what the dreams entailed. And what they say after he finishes is that they believe that the dreams foretold great harm to the king's kingdom, to the king's wealth, and also to his life. And so when the king asks for their advice about what to do, they actually tell him that appropriate sacrifices need to be made to avert the danger. And this usually means that there are animal sacrifices and other offerings that are to be made. And so the king agrees, not knowing any better and also being quite shaken up. And when Queen Malika sees that the king is not his usual self, she asks him what has happened, and he explains to her that he's had these terrifying dreams and he doesn't understand. And Queen Malika, being quite a special kind of person, she says to him, "Have you consulted the Buddha? And he's the great Brahmin of all Brahmins." And of course, King Pasenadi of Kosala says, "No, I haven't." And so he decides that he should really go and ask because, of course, the Buddha can understand the meaning of those dreams. And so he goes to visit the Buddha. When the king reached the monastery, he paid respects to the Buddha and sat down. The Buddha asked, "What brings your majesty here so early in the morning?" And the king replied, "Just before daybreak, Venerable Sir, I dreamed 16 terrifying dreams. My Brahmin advisors have warned me that my dreams foretell calamity. To avert the evil, they are preparing to sacrifice many animals wherever 4 roads meet. Queen Malika suggested that I ask you to tell me what these dreams really mean and what will come of them." And then the Buddha says, "It is true, sire, that I alone can explain the significance of your dreams and tell you what will come of them. Tell me your dreams as they appear to you." "I will, Blessed One," answered the king, and he began relating his dreams. "In the first dream, I saw 4 jet black bulls," the king began. "They came together from the 4 cardinal directions to the royal courtyard with every intention to fight. A great crowd of people gathered to see the bullfight. The bulls, however, only made a show of fighting, pawing and bellowing. Finally, they went off without fighting at all. This was my first dream." The Buddha explains the first dream by saying, "Sire, that dream will have no result in your lifetime or mine, but in the distant future, when kings are stingy, when citizens are unrighteous, when the world is perverted, and when good is waning and evil is waxing. In those days of world's decline, no rain will fall from the heavens, the monsoons will forget their season, the crops will wither, and famine will stalk the land. At that time, immense clouds will gather from the 4 quarters of the heavens, as if for rain. Farmers will rush to bring in the rice they had spread to dry in the sun. Men will take their spades and hurry to repair the dikes. The thunder will roar and the lightning will flash from the clouds. However, just as the bulls in your dream didn't fight, these clouds will retreat without giving any rain. This is what shall come of this dream." Throughout this Jataka, the Buddha refers to the king. And for us, the king represents the leaders of our world. So the politicians, the statesmen, those of the ruling elite. And in this particular dream, the Buddha is saying that when leaders are stingy, when citizens are unrighteous, when the world is perverted, when good is waning and evil is waxing. So we see evidence of this in our world, where we see leaders being very self-interested, where citizens are collectively more greedy. They are breeding more defilements, more unvirtuous behavior. And when the world is perverted, well, we see evidence of that in the news, in our TV programming, and in behaviors in our community. So what is also true is the result of that. We do see, as the Buddha has said, where rain doesn't fall, where we experience droughts, and where monsoons are late or unseasonal. We see evidence of that. When you look at the news articles, and we have a few here on this slide, then you see that this is coming to be. So it is interesting, if not worrying, to see that some of these things that the Buddha is talking about are coming true right now. The Buddha then asks the king what his second dream was, and King Pasenadi of Kosala says, "My second dream was about tiny trees and shrubs which burst through the soil. When they were scarcely more than a few inches high, they flowered and bore fruit. This was my second dream." The Buddha explains this second dream by saying, "Sire, this dream will be realized in future days when the world has fallen into decay and when human lives are short. Passions then will be so strong that even very young girls will cohabit with men. Despite their immaturity, they will get pregnant and have children. The flowers and fruit symbolize their babies." With this second dream, when you look at where we are in the world today, we also see evidence of what the Buddha is talking about. We do see human lifespan shortening. We also see that young girls do cohabit with men and they do fall pregnant. So teenage pregnancy has been an issue. And we also now have reality TV programs that look into the lives of teenagers who are pregnant and who are mothers. So this is what the Buddha refers to as the future days when the world has fallen into decay. Now, we may not have got to the extent that the Buddha is actually referring to, but we are heading in that direction. The Buddha then asks the king what his third dream is, and the king says, "I saw cows sucking milk from their very own newborn calves. This was my third dream." The Buddha then explains the third dream by saying, "This dream will come about only when age is no longer respected. In that future time, young people will have no regard for their parents or parents-in-law. Children will handle the family estate themselves. If it pleases them, they will give food and clothing to the old folks. But if it doesn't suit them, they will withhold their gifts. Thus the old people, destitute and dependent, will survive only by the favor and whim of their own children, like big cows suckled by day-old calves." With this third dream, the Buddha is really referring to the disrespect and mistreatment of elders, and we see traces of that already. So we may not be to the extent that the Buddha is referring to, but we are heading in that direction when you see news articles and criminal activity where elders are abused, whether it's financial, physical, or mental. And also when you look at when people get very old or they're put into care homes and the conditions are considered atrocious or really bad. So this is something that when the society declines and there is no gratitude towards parents, then this is also a very unwholesome result. The Buddha then asks the king about his fourth dream, and the king says, "Men unyoked a team of strong, sturdy oxen and replaced them with young steers, too weak to draw the load. Those young steers refused to pull. They stood stock still, so that the wagons didn't move at all. This was my fourth dream." The Buddha explains the fourth dream by saying, "Here again, the dream will not come to pass until the future, in the days of wicked kings. In days to come, unjust and parsimonious kings will show no honor to wise leaders skilled in diplomacy. They will not appoint experienced learned judges to the courts. On the contrary, they will honor the very young and foolish, and will appoint the most inexperienced and unprincipled to the courts. Naturally, these appointees, because of their ignorance of statecraft and the law, will not be able to bear the burden of their responsibilities. Because of their incompetence, they will have to throw off the yoke of public office. When that happens, the aged and wise lords will remember being passed over, and even though they are able to cope with all the difficulties, they will refuse to help, saying, 'It is no business of ours since we have become outsiders.' They will remain aloof, and the government will fall to ruins. It is just like when the young steers, not strong enough for the burden, were yoked instead of the team of sturdy oxen." With this fourth dream, what we are looking at is really how we are governed by the law. So we are governed usually by wise judges, competent judges, qualified judges, those with experience. But when you appoint young, incompetent, or maybe inexperienced judges, it will have an impact on how we're governed. It will rock the foundation. So right now we're starting to see evidence of that. Young judges being appointed, maybe inexperienced newcomers, people that are unqualified. And so we can expect to see some impact on the way we are governed, on the way that the rulings are being set. The Buddha then asks the king about his fifth dream, and the king says, I saw an incredible horse with a mouth on each side of its head, being fed fodder on both sides. That dreadful horse ate voraciously with both its mouths. This was my fifth dream. The Buddha explains this fifth dream by saying, this dream will also come true only in the future, in the days of unrighteous and irresponsible kings, who will appoint covetous men to be judges. These despicable magistrates, blind to virtue and honesty, will take bribes from both sides as they sit in the seat of judgment. They will be doubly corrupt, just like the horse that ate fodder with two mouths at once. With this fifth dream, it's linked to the fourth because we're still talking about the rule of law and who we're appointing to the courts. So across the world right now, we see doubly corrupt judges, judges who are willing to take bribes from both sides, who are not upholding the law, who are making judgments to the detriment of the law. And when you see that the leaders of the world are appointing these corrupt people. You have no confidence in those leaders as well. They are weak. They are corrupt themselves. And so you see that across the world, and you see that the world is hurtling towards decline. And there can be no confidence when the world is out of balance like this, when unvirtuous behavior is never punished. In fact, it seems to be rewarded. The Buddha then asks the king about his sixth dream, and the king says, I saw people holding out a brightly burnished golden bowl which must have been worth a fortune. They were actually begging an old jackal to urinate in it. Then I saw the repulsive beast do just that. This was my sixth dream. The Buddha explains the meaning of this dream and says, this dream too will come to be only in the remote future, when immoral kings, although from a royal line themselves, will mistrust the sons of their old nobility, preferring instead the lowest born of the country. Because of the king's blindness, nobles will decline, and the low-born will rise in rank. Naturally, the great families will give their daughters to them in marriage. The union of the noble maidens with the ignoble, nouveau rich, will be like the old jackal urinating into the golden bowl. With this sixth dream, we see the Buddha talking about the descent of the noble-born and the ascent of the low-born. We don't usually talk in these terms, but we do see in the world today the appearance of royalty marrying commoners, so that's more prevalent these days. But in our own terms, we can also look at this in terms of morality. When you have children of moral character coming from moral families, and when they are married off to those who are immoral, who have bad behavior, then this is what happens when there is a decline. The Buddha then asks the king about his seventh dream, and the king says, I saw a man braiding rope. As he worked, he dropped the finished rope at his feet. Under his bench, unknown to him, lay a hungry female jackal, which kept eating the rope as fast as he braided it. This was my seventh dream. The Buddha then explains this seventh dream and says, this dream also will happen only in far-off days. At that time, women will crave men, strong drink, extravagant clothes, jewelry, and entertainment. In their shamelessness, these women will get drunk with their lovers and carry on shamelessly. They will neglect their homes and families. They will pawn household valuables, selling everything for drink and amusements, even the seed needed for the next crop. Just as the hungry jackal under the bench ate the rope of the rope maker, so these women will squander the savings earned by their husband's labor. With this seventh dream, the Buddha is really talking about the women who are shameless and neglectful. So they put their own needs above anybody else, above their husbands, if they have husbands, above their children, and above the family home, the family wealth. And they set a very poor example for their children and for their community. So they are more prone to be driven by their sensual desires, so whether it's to drink, for sexual relations, even to cheat, and to have very loose morals, and to be very spendthrift. And we have TV shows that show this sort of thing right now. The contrast is to the wise woman, the one that has a healthy sense of moral shame, who doesn't neglect their family or their partner. And this is something that you can see when you don't have the right role model, it leads to more of the same. And so there's evidence in the world today of this kind of behavior, this kind of example. The Buddha then asks the king about his 8th dream, and the king says, "At a palace gate there stood a big pitcher, full to the brim. Around it stood many empty pitchers. From all directions there came a steady stream of people carrying pots of water which they poured into the already full pitcher. The water from that full pitcher kept overflowing and wastefully soaking into the sand. Still, the people came and poured more and more water into the overflowing vessel. Not a single person even glanced at the empty pitchers. This was my 8th dream." The Buddha then explains the meaning of this 8th dream by saying, "This dream too will not come to pass until the future, when the world is in decline. The kingdom will grow weak, and its kings will be poorer and more demanding. These kings in their poverty and selfishness will make the whole country work exclusively for them. They will force citizens to neglect their own work and to labor only for the throne. For the king's sake, they will plant sugarcane, make sugar mills, and boil down molasses. For the king's sake, they will plant flower gardens and orchards and gather fruits. They will harvest all the crops and fill the royal stone rooms and warehouses to overflowing. But they will be unable to even glance at their own empty barns at home. It will be like filling and overfilling the full pitcher, heedless of the needy, empty ones." With this 8th dream, we do see evidence of weak, selfish leaders in the world, enslaving their citizens for them to work very hard, being underpaid and being pushed to the brink of financial ruin, and also with a feeling or a sense of hopelessness. The real contrast with this particular Jataka story is when the Buddha talks about Sattviti kings, the kings that existed at a time where they were very moral. They kept their precepts, and they encouraged their citizens to keep their precepts. And at the same time, there were many blessings in those kingdoms. The contrast is to now, where you have leaders who don't have those qualities. They don't keep precepts. They're quite immoral. And so the result is you have countries and the citizens of those countries pushed to the brink, enslaved to those weak, selfish leaders. The Buddha then asks the king about his 9th dream, and the king says, "I saw a deep pool with sloping banks, overgrown with lotuses. From all directions a variety of animals came to drink water from that pool. Strangely, the deep water in the middle was terribly muddy, but the water at the edges, where all those thirsty creatures had descended into the pool, was unaccountably clear and sparkling. This was my 9th dream." The Buddha explains this 9th dream and says, "This dream too will not come to pass until the future, when kings grow increasingly corrupt, ruling according to their own whim and pleasure. They will never make judgments according to what is right. Being greedy, they will grow fat on lucrative bribes. Never showing mercy or compassion to their subjects, they will be fierce and cruel. These kings will amass wealth by crushing their subjects like stalks of sugarcane in a mill, and by taxing them to the last penny. Unable to pay the oppressive taxes, the citizens will abandon their villages, towns and cities, and will flee like refugees to the borders. The heart of the country will be a wilderness, while the remote areas along the borders will teem with people. The country will be just like the pool, muddy in the middle and clear at the edges." This 9th dream is also linked with the 8th. Not just weak and selfish leaders, we now have corrupt rulers, and there is evidence in the world today. There is corruption at the level of country assets, and there is corruption at the level of world assets. Wars are fought over assets and land and power. So citizens are the ones that bear the brunt of it. They work hard to eke out a life for them and their families. But what happens is when you can no longer afford things, or you no longer have access to essential services in your country, when the corruption is so rife, you have to flee like a refugee. And so we see evidence of that from country to country with this global refugee crisis. The Buddha then asks the king about his 10th dream, and the king says, "I saw rice boiling in a pot without getting done. By not getting done, I mean that it looked as though the cooking was going on in 3 distinct stages, which were sharply delineated and separate from each other. One part of the rice was sodden, another part of the rice was hard and raw, and the third part looked like it was perfectly cooked. This was my 10th dream. The Buddha explains this 10th dream by saying, "This dream too will not be fulfilled until the future. In days to come, kings will become unrighteous, the nobles will follow the king's example, and so will the Brahmins. The townsmen, the merchants, and at last even the farmers will be corrupted. Eventually everyone in the country, the sages and even the gods of the land, will become immoral. Even the winds that blow over the realm of such an unrighteous king will grow cruel and lawless, because even the skies and the spirits of the skies over that land will be disturbed. They will cause a drought. Rain will never fall on the whole kingdom at once. It may be rain in the upper districts, but in the lower it will not. In one place, a heavy downpour will damage the crops, while in another area the crops will wither from drought. The crops sown within a single kingdom, like the rice in the one pot, shall have no uniform character." The 10th dream is also linked to the 9th. When you have leaders who are corrupt, they're unrighteous, then what happens is the country eventually becomes completely immoral. So this is one of the dreams where we're definitely not there yet. But at the same time, you're starting to see the result of the corruption, of the unrighteous behavior, the corrupt behavior. So what you see that the Buddha alludes to is rain will never fall on the whole kingdom at once. It rains in one place and then in the other it doesn't. Or there's a heavy downpour like a flood and it damages the crops. So we see that right now. What we don't see when we look at these news items and reports of flooding and droughts in the same country is we don't see that it's because of immoral behavior, unrighteous behavior, unwholesome behavior. But there is a link to it. The more unrighteous, the more greedy, the more there is rapacious greed being evident in a place, then the more you will see floods and droughts. The more that there is income inequality, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. You see this because that's where the unrighteous behavior is happening in a country. And so when you look at the news headlines and you see in Australia, in Sri Lanka, in California, in different places that there is flooding in one part of the country and drought in another, you know that there is something seriously wrong. Or where you look across the globe and you see floods in China, but you see drought in Africa, then you see that there is something seriously wrong. And this is where the Buddha's teaching is the most powerful, in that throughout all these dreams, he's actually looking at the world is declining because of immoral behavior, unrighteous behavior, unwholesome behavior through body, speech, and mind. If this increases, then these full dreams come true. The Buddha then asks the king about the 11th dream, and the king says, "I saw rancid buttermilk being bartered for precious sandalwood, worth a fortune in gold. This was my 11th dream." The Buddha explains the meaning of this 11th dream by saying, "This will happen only in the distant future, when my teaching is waning. In those days there will be many greedy, shameless bhikkhus, who for the sake of their bellies dare to preach the very words in which I have warned against greed. Because they desert the truth to gratify their stomachs, and because they sided with sectarians, their preaching will not lead to nibbana. Their only thought as they preach will be to use fine words and sweet voices, to induce lay believers to give them costly robes, delicate food, and every comfort. Others will seat themselves beside the highways, at busy street corners, or at the doors of kings' palaces, where they will stoop to preach for money, even for a pittance. Thus, these monks will barter away for food, for robes, or for coins, my teaching which leads to liberation from suffering. They will be like those who exchange precious sandalwood, worth a fortune in pure gold, for rancid buttermilk." With this 11th dream, the Buddha is really referring to the greedy, shameless monastics, that when the world is in such decline and the Buddha's teaching is actually declining, it's not so readily available, then what you find are this shameless behavior of monastics, that they are preaching Dhamma or teaching Dhamma for the sake of their own self-interest, for greed, hatred, and delusion. And they're doing it for requisites or gain, honor, and praise. And when this happens, what they are doing is they're exchanging the sandalwood for the rancid buttermilk, that they are the representatives of the fully enlightened Buddha, and instead they're going for things which are of the sensual nature, that are fleeting, and that you can't really hold on to. Whereas the teaching of the Buddha, when you really understand it, you know that that is the most precious thing in the world. But what we can see is that there is evidence in the world today that there are monastics using fine words and sweet voices to induce lay followers to give the requisites, but what they're exchanging with the lay people is not for the sweetness of the Dhamma, none of the Dhamma that's going to lead to Nibbana. And that is one of the most unfortunate things. Then the Buddha asked the king about his 12th dream, and the king says, I saw dried gourds sinking in the water. This was my 12th dream. The Buddha explains the meaning of the 12th dream and says, this dream also will not have its fulfillment until the future, in the days of unjust kings when the world is perverted. In those days, kings will favor the lowborn, not the sons of nobility. The lowborn will become great lords, while the nobles will sink into poverty. In the king's court and in the courts of justice, the words of the lowborn alone will be recognized, so that they, like the dried gourds, will be firmly established. In the assemblies of monks, it will be the same. Whenever there are inquiries about proper behavior, rules of conduct, or discipline, only the counsel of wicked, corrupt monks will be considered. The advice of modest monks will be ignored. It will be as when the empty gourd sank. With this 12th dream, the Buddha is really talking about the time in the future where there are unjust leaders and the world is perverted, and the lowborn are favored and the noble sink to poverty, and corrupt monks are glorified and the wise monks are ignored or shunned. And so you see traces of this right now. You see where the words of the unwise are raised above the words of the wise. And you see this when we glorify celebrity culture, we glorify reality TV, we glorify leaders who are unqualified for their positions, and when we glorify monks who are interested in politics rather than practicing the Dhamma. So we are heading in the direction of decline. The Buddha then asks the king about his 13th dream, and the king says, I saw huge blocks of solid rock, as big as houses, floating like dried gourds upon the waters. This was my 13th dream. The Buddha explains the 13th dream and says, this dream also will not come to pass until those times of which I have spoken. At that time the unrighteous kings will show honor to the lowborn, who will become great lords, while the true nobles will fade into obscurity. The nobles will receive no respect, while the ignorant upstarts will be granted all honors. In the king's court and in the law courts, the words of the nobles, learned in the law, will drift idly by like those solid rocks. They will not penetrate deep into the hearts of men. When the wise speak, the ignorant will merely laugh them to scorn, saying, what is it these fellows are saying? In the assemblies of monks as well, people will not respect the excellent monks. Their words will not sink deep, but will drift idly by, the same as the rocks floating on the water. This 13th dream is linked to the 12th, and it's when leaders are asking us to give respect and honor to people that are not worthy of that. They are foolish or unwise and ignorant, and they are pushing away the wise ones. They're disrespecting the wise ones, and so you can see that it leads to decline. So you see this already, traces of it in the courts, in the government, in the business community, in our own communities. And what's really important is to make sure that we know what is wise and what is unwise. Because otherwise what happens is we give more credence to those who are ignorant and place more emphasis on their words, repeat their words, and they are the wrong examples. And we ignore and shun those who are wise, and we disrespect them. So at the moment, we are fortunate that we're not there yet, but there is danger ahead when we have unwise leaders, unrighteous leaders, pointing us in the wrong direction. towards the wrong people. The Buddha then asks the king about his 14th dream, and the king says, I saw tiny frogs no bigger than miniature flowerets, swiftly pursuing huge black snakes and devouring them. This was my 14th dream. The Buddha explains the meaning of this 14th dream and says, this dream too will not have its fulfillment until those future days of which I have already spoken, when the world is declining. At that time, men's passions will be so strong that husbands will be thoroughly infatuated with their childish wives. Men will lose all judgment and self-respect. Being completely smitten, they will place their infantile wives in charge of everything: household staff, livestock, granaries, gold and silver, everything in the house. Should the overfond husband presume to ask for some money or for a favorite robe, he will be told to mind his own business and not to be so inquisitive about property in her house. These abusive young wives will exercise their power over their husbands as if the men were slaves. It will be like tiny frogs which gobbled up the big black snakes. With this 14th dream, the Buddha is referencing young wives exercising power and control over foolish men, and this could be different genders associated with that, but essentially it's where an older person gives power and control of their assets to a younger person, and then they become enslaved to that younger person because of their sensual desires. Now, this is the time that the Buddha is talking about the world being in decline, but we see traces of this in the world today. The Buddha then asked the king about his 15th dream, and the king says, I saw a village crow, a vile creature with all 10 vices, attended by an entourage of mandarin ducks, beautiful birds with feathers of golden sheen. This was my 15th dream. The Buddha explains the meaning of this 15th dream and says, this dream too will not come to pass until the far distant future, in the reign of weakling kings, when there will be kings who know nothing about ruling. They will be cowards and fools. Fearing revolt and revolution, they will elevate their footmen, bath attendants, and barbers to nobility. These kings will ignore the real nobility, cut off from royal favor and unable to support themselves. Bona fide nobles will be reduced to dancing attendants on the upstarts, as when the crow had regal mandarin ducks for his retinue. With this 15th dream, the Buddha is really talking about a time in the future where the rulers don't really know how to rule, or the leaders don't know how to lead. And so they're quite cowardly and foolish. And so what they do is they put the wrong people into power, fearing revolt of the citizens of their country. So they elevate people that they think will overcome any kind of revolution. So as the Buddha has said in the explanation, it could be a footman, a bath attendant, a barber. So it could be a farmer, it could be an actor, it could be someone that they think will be able to withstand any kind of revolt or revolution. And so the wise people or the noble people of the country end up dancing to the tune of someone who is not up to the task. And so when you look at this, you can also see maybe potentially it's cash for honors or the celebrity culture that enters into the fray. So rulers are picking the wrong kinds of people for elevated positions. And so this is when you start to see the decline. And we probably can look out into our world today and see traces of this. Then the Buddha asked the king for his final dream, the 16th dream. And the king says, I saw goats chasing wolves and eating them. At the sight of goats in the distance, the wolves fled, terror-stricken, quaking with fear to hide in thickets. Such was my dream. This was my 16th dream. The Buddha explains the meaning of this final dream when he says, this dream too will not have its fulfillment until the reign of immoral kings. The low-born will be raised to important posts and will become royal favorites. True nobles will sink into obscurity and distress, gaining power in the law courts because of the king's favors. The parvenu will claim the ancestral estates of the impoverished old nobility, demanding their titles and all their property. When the real nobles plead their rights in court, the king's minions will have them beaten and tortured, then taken by the throat and thrown out with words of scorn. That will teach you to know your place, fools, they will shout. How dare you dispute with us? The king shall hear of your insolence, and we will have your hands and feet chopped off. At this, the terrified nobles will agree that black is white, and that their own estates belong to the lowly upstarts. They will then hurry home and cower in the agony of fear. Likewise, at that time, evil monks will harass good worthy monks until the worthy ones flee from the monasteries to the jungle. This oppression of true nobles by the lowborn and of good monks by the evil monks will be like the intimidation of wolves by goats. This 16th dream is linked to the 15th. It just goes a step further. It's the extent to which those foolish, ignorant people that have been elected to high positions, they're now oppressing the wise people, the noble people. And so it's not just the threat of assets being taken away, they are literally taken away. It's not just the threat of being hurt, they're literally being beaten and taken away in white vans. All those sorts of things. And so what happens is the true nobles or the wise people in the world, they start to have to agree with the lowly people that are in the positions of authority. And when it comes to evil monks and nuns, what happens is they do harass the worthy ones. And so the worthy ones have to go to the forest. They have to leave the monasteries and go to the forest, and it's very hard to find them. So the oppression of true nobles, true wise people becomes more evident. And so what you have now is probably not so close to this. We're not there yet. But this is what the Buddha is saying is on the horizon. When you have the wrong people in important posts, and you have the wrong words being activated and the wrong decisions being made, then you will see this type of oppression. So there may be traces of it in the world today, in different countries, but we're not fully there yet. On this slide, we have a summary of the order of the 16 dreams that starts with the 4 bulls all the way down to the goats. And in essence, when you look at the summary of these dreams, you see that what is very prevalent in all of them is around unwholesome behavior, intoxication with sensual pleasures, having foolish ideas, wrong view as opposed to right view. So these 16 terrifying dreams of King Pasenadi of Kosala, they don't bode very well when it comes to the karmic result of bad actions, immorality, defilements. The contrast to it, as was said before, is really when you are ruled, governed by those that keep precepts that are moral. That is a real blessing on the world, because what happens is the rest of the world starts to follow that good example of a good leader. What people normally say is they're crying out for a good leader, and a good leader doesn't mean charisma and all the worldly type of aspects. In the Buddha's teaching, a good leader, a good ruler, is one who is wise, one who is moral, one who keeps precepts. Because the result of keeping those precepts is a good result. And so what we've seen in this Jataka story is really all the bad results that come with bad behavior, unwise choices, raising foolish people, belittling wise people, being intoxicated with sensual pleasures, not seeing the danger in sensual pleasures. So the outcome is very bleak, it's awful, it's terrifying. And so there's much to learn from understanding these dreams. We haven't gone into too much detail because it's really important for each person to contemplate each of the dreams and not to presuppose or assume that each of us knows exactly what it means. But it's good to contemplate them ourselves and learn how they can be understood at an individual level and how they can be understood at a collective level. The Jataka story concludes with the Buddha confirming to King Pasenadi of Kosala that his Brahmin advisors were giving him the wrong advice. They were acting out of greed and selfishness, out of wanting personal gain when prescribing those animal sacrifices to avert the danger. And he also confirmed that kings of the past had also dreamt the same 16 terrifying dreams, and their Brahmin advisors had also given the wrong advice to do animal sacrifices. And one story that he related or recounted to King Pasenadi of Kosala was about King Brahmadatta, who at the time had the same 16 terrifying dreams, got the wrong advice from the Brahmins, and had questioned the Brahmins about animal sacrifices because he was worried that it would incur a lot of loss of life and whether it was the right thing to do. And there was a young Brahmin who didn't agree with the elder Brahmin's advice, and he came upon a highly attained ascetic in the gardens of the king. And when he realized that this highly attained ascetic could explain the dreams to King Brahmadatta, he asked him to explain them to the king. And so he did. And after the explanation, what happened was the sacrifices didn't go ahead, and the king Brahmadatta understood the meaning. And the Buddha then relayed that Venerable Ananda at that time, his past life was King Brahmadatta, and Venerable Sariputta was the young Brahmin who found the highly attained ascetic, and the highly attained ascetic was the Bodhisattva. We can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem, wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.